So I'm going to talk about something about black holes and something about information paradox, and it's going to be a very inexhaustive and qualitative talk. And I don't really know much about either of these things, and I want to learn. So this was a good enough opportunity. So I decided to go ahead with it. So without further ado, let's begin. So yeah. So yeah, we'll start with some facts and ideas. So first of all, the major part of this talk is sourced from this review, the entropy of Hawking radiation that came out this year. So yeah. So basically, when we drop an object inside a black hole, the black hole responds. It responds dynamically. There are the ripples occur on its surface, and there are perturbations, disturbances, and then the black hole eventually in due time settles down into some different radius in some different size. So as it turns out, this reaction that the black hole has to to a change in its defining variables is uh, is is of course governed by the Einstein equations. The Einstein equations take this very interesting form, as I've said as I've noted in equation one, and this is the form that kind of motivates us. I'll just denote the terms here. That the kappa here denotes surface gravity. A surface, the black hole doesn't have a quote unquote surface to talk about so much. So surface gravity is a bit tricky to define for a black hole, but still it can be done in terms of Killing vectors and their derivatives. So yeah, so we have the surface gravity here. Then the change in the area of the black hole, and it equals the change in the mass of the black hole, which is basically the energy of the black hole. And with it, here we have taken a rotating black hole here. So we have a rotational velocity of the black hole and the angular momentum J. Of course, if the black hole is there will be a term involving the potential of the electric potential of the black hole and its charge. So, anyways, so this is the general idea. So now this expression looks very suggestive. It looks very much like the first law of thermodynamics. So if somebody were to have a harebrained idea and claim that the black hole has a temperature and an entropy, which is related to the surface gravity and the area of the black hole, it's proportional via some appropriate proportionality constant. Then if we could get the appropriate proportionality constant, we could write it in this form here as written in equation 3. And this indeed looks almost exactly like the first law of thermodynamics. So at least formally, there seems to be that there is some analogy between this way in which a black hole reacts and the first law of thermodynamics. Also, there are two more laws of thermodynamics: the zeroth law and the second law. So do we have an analog for this at black holes? Yes, we do. Something that looks similar. For the third law, the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases. The analog there we have is Hawking's law for a classical stationary black hole, that the area of the black hole always increases in a classical theory of gravity. So we have another law that looks similar. And lastly, we have the zeroth law of thermodynamics, which says that a body in thermal equilibrium has a constant temperature. Or as it turns out, a black hole in equilibrium with no matter falling in or nothing like that has a constant surface gravity. So there are strong again suggestive evidences that there could be some relation between thermodynamics and the properties of a black hole. It was all suggestive till 75, when Hawking studied quantum fields in curved spacetime near a black hole and saw that a black hole does indeed have a observable temperature, which he then gave by this formula, which is for a collapsing, which is for a black hole formed from gravitational collapse, as this h cross here again kappa is the surface gravity. So it came out in this very iconic paper. So now this formula for the temperature also allows us, so if we now believe this to be true, this allows us to fix the proportionality constant for the entropy also. So we had assumed that it was proportional to the area. So we can fix the proportionality constant, and we can get that the entropy of the black hole is the area of the black hole times h cross 4 h cross gn. Of course, this can actually be derived formally in a certain way, but that's something separate. Now, the total entropy of the black hole and the environment around it. So this thing also has a contribution from the quantum fields that are present outside the horizon, that is outside the black hole. So we can claim that we can say that the total entropy of the black hole would be something of this form, which is the area of the horizon by 4h cross gn plus s outside, which is the entropy of the matter, gravitons, and whatever, all the quantum fields in the semi-classical description that are outside the black hole. It was found that the total entropy, this total entropy, follows the second law of thermodynamics. That is, it always increases under any unitary evolution. So this result again is actually stronger than the classical area theorem that I mentioned a few minutes back, is because it takes into account Hawking radiation and other such semi-classical effects also. It's not a completely classical statement. So it's a bit stronger than that. So in other processes where the area decreases actually, but then the total entropy, this total term, increases. So the area entropy term is usually very huge. So it's usually of the order of 10 to the power 40 to 10 to the power 85, or sometimes even more. Now, since the entropy of a system, of a normal thermodynamic system that we know, is a measure of the number of degrees of freedom that are available to it. So this suggests that a black hole has a huge number of degrees of freedom. And these are, I mean, not well known about. I mean, that's still an object of research. So this is basically the motivation behind, or some hint into the direction of black hole thermodynamics. But we get into something more concrete now when we start talking about Hawking radiation. Before we go into exactly what Hawking radiation is, we need to clear up. I need to show you some phenomena like temperature. So with with that, we start with the metric of a Schwarzschild black hole. So a metric of a Schwarzschild. This is the metric of a Schwarzschild black hole, a 4-dimensional Schwarzschild black hole, where Rs is the Schwarzschild radius given by this well-known formula, which is the size of the black hole. So we'll ignore the angular directions in the subsequent parts, because they don't really play any role, and you can just add them at each step and it doesn't really change anything. So we'll first zoom in near the event horizon. So if you zoom in near the event horizon, we can make this particular coordinate change where r goes to rs 1 plus rho square by 4 rs square, and t goes to 2 rs tau. These are perfectly valid coordinate change that we can make. Now expand for rho very, very less than rs, because they are very near to the horizon. So very near to the horizon of the Schwarzschild black hole, we see that the metric takes this following form here. Now this form looks very suggestive. It looks very similar to what we would find in a Minkowski spacetime. We can make this more concrete by the following identification. We can make this following transformation. We can choose this following coordinates x0 as rho sine hyperbolic tau and x1 rho cos hyperbolic tau. And as it turns out, this would transform this metric from this equation 10 into equation 11, which we know is just two-dimensional Minkowski space. So according to a freely falling observer, this tells us that according to a freely falling observer, the horizon is a ordinary region in space-time. Like any other ordinary regions in space-time, we can construct a locally Minkowski space-time there, Minkowski space. So this is which is basically the equivalence principle. So so the space-time geometry of a Schwarzschild black hole that is formed by gravitational collapse is given by this diagram. So yeah, so this line is the horizon here. This is the Penrose diagram of that black hole. This here is the star collapsing inward. This dotted line is the singularity, and this is the past null boundary. This is the future null boundary. These are not at 45 degree because my drawing is bad, and this is denoted by this r equal to infinity, t equal to infinity, and this r equal to infinity, t equal to -. So anyways, this is just the ordinary Penrose diagram of the black hole. So we can zoom in near this region, near the black hole region, and this blue curve we can take it as a trajectory of an observer. We can zoom in near this region, and now we can see in the x0, x1 coordinate how it looks like. So, so if we zoom in near this horizon and this trajectory we have, if we define this trajectory, I mean, this is a trajectory of a particle of an observer that is held at a constant value of rho. So an observer held at a constant value of rho, as you can see here from these terms, that in the x0, x1 coordinates they would follow a hyperbolic path. So because of this, this is the red line is the path that they follow, and this time coordinate tau evolves along it while the rho coordinate is held constant. As it turns out, this observer is actually a uniformly accelerated observer in this Minkowski space. A uniformly accelerated observer with acceleration equal to inverse of this value of rho. It's a fairly straightforward calculation and can be easily shown. So in these near horizon coordinates, an observer who is placed at this fixed value of rho will follow a trajectory of a uniformly accelerated observer in Minkowski space. So again, I will just reiterate that if you hold an observer very close to the black hole, the observer will feel like he or she is accelerating in a Minkowski space. But accelerations in Minkowski space mean a very interesting thing. So uniform acceleration. So uniform accelerating observer in a flat space detects thermal radiation, which is the Unruh effect. So there is a simple trick to heuristically just see what this temperature would be. A bit intuitive thing. So the coordinate change that we made from rho tau to x0 x1, it looks very much like the polar to Cartesian coordinate transformation that we make, but the signs are a bit off. But those signs can be fixed if we make the following identification, which is if we perform a Wick rotation and we identify tau as some complex quantity iota theta and x0 as again some complex quantity iota x0 e, which makes this transformation that we had defined here as x0 x1 as a completely Cartesian to polar kind of a transformation. But however, since we have used Wick rotation, we have gone from Minkowski space to a Euclidean plane. Now in Minkowski space, if we had fixed rho, we were traveling on a hyperbolic path. But in a Euclidean space, if we have fixed rho, it means we are moving in a circle. It should be diameter, in a circle of diameter 2 pi rho. Circumference. Sorry, of circumference 2 pi rho. So anyways, so we know that now we have moved over to a Euclidean plane. So now Euclidean, we know that the interesting significance of a Euclidean plane. We know that the Euclidean time evolution on a circle is related to the computation of thermodynamic quantities in the physical system. For example, the thermodynamic partition function, which is defined as this trace of e to the power minus bh, where this beta is the inverse temperature. Now this beta can be seen that we have gone to the Euclidean space. Now we have Euclidean time. Now if the Euclidean time has a periodicity, we see that this periodicity is actually the same as this thing beta here. Yeah, we'll show this a bit later. So this periodicity is the same thing as this beta here, and the trace is a consequence of the fact that we are on a circle and we have same boundary conditions. So you see that beta is equal to this. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, that periodicity in the tau, I thought it comes due to the you want the geometry to be smooth in the metric, right?
Yeah. I will that avoiding the conical singularity is something that I'll come to.
Yeah, and now I didn't get that how you got this. I mean periodicity here. I mean how the argument comes.
I mean, just hold on for the next few slides, and if then your questions aren't answered, then I can try. Okay. Right now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this periodicity. So I mean, continuing on. So thus the temperature. See, beta is this, and the length of the Euclidean time evolution we saw was this 2 pi rho, because it's an evolution in this theta. So it's the constant rho, it moves, the theta goes from 0 to the theta goes around by the period of 2 pi rho. So this gives us that the temperature that the observer sees is 1 by 2 pi rho. Now, as I had mentioned before, that rho is actually inverse of the acceleration of the uniform acceleration. So we can inverse it and we can get this a by 2 pi. So this is the temperature that is recorded by a physically accelerating, by a thermometer which is physically accelerating, which is essentially held at a constant rho outside the black hole, at a constant radius outside the black hole, but very close to the black hole. This is a reference for this. So this is a proper temperature. So again, this is a proper temperature. It is a temperature that is felt by the observer in that observer's frame of reference. So it goes to infinity as rho goes to 0, and it decreases as rho increases. So this decrease in this temperature is consistent with the thing that about thermal equilibrium in presence of gravity. More specifically, it is consistent with something called the Tolman relation for a spherically symmetric configuration in thermal equilibrium. So the Tolman relation is this: the proper temperature evaluated at some radius in a spherically symmetric configuration times square root of the time component of the metric is a constant. So so we know what the temperature felt by an observer close to the horizon is. We also know what this g tau term is. It's minus rho square, as we have seen in the Lorentzian case, and we can plug these two back inside and find the constant. The constant turns out 1 by 2 pi, but our point is finding the temperature that a faraway observer will feel. Now the Tolman relation holds for all values of r, So we can undo this scaling that we had done, take it back, the r to rho scaling that we had done. We can take it back and take it very far away from the horizon, so far away that just scroll up back. If we take it very far away from the horizon, this term is essentially -1 as r is very, very larger than rs. So yeah. So once we do that, we see that the temperature that is observed by an observer very, very far away from the black hole is actually 1 by 4 pi rs. This is what is known as the Hawking temperature, and it is the temperature that is observed by an observer who is very far away in terms of with respect to the Schwarzschild radius. So yeah, this relation between the Euclidean time and temperature is a bit tricky. I mean, at least confusing, at least to me, at least. So we need to explain a bit more about that. So we'll start. We'll talk about the Euclidean black hole and stuff. So let's start here. That the Euclidean time is the imaginary time and the Lorentzian time is the real time, and they are related by this relation: t is equal to iota te. Now there's a few ways to see that this periodicity in imaginary time, periodicity in te, is the same as temperature. Now say we have a thermal state. We have a thermal state in our usually Minkowski space-time, and the thermal state is given by this expression trace of e to the power minus beta h, where beta is the inverse temperature. Now, if we were to calculate any observable for some operator O, which is given in this, then we can easily see that if we evolve the operator via the ordinary unitary time evolution, we see that there is a periodicity where the Lorentzian time changes by this I beta, or the inverse of that temperature. Basically, if the Euclidean time te changes by beta, then we see that the observable does not change. So a thermodynamic quantity calculated here has a periodicity in Euclidean time, and that periodicity is equal to the inverse of the temperature. So if you have a thermodynamic observable which is time dependent, and then we can shift it to the Euclidean time. So if we can go to the Euclidean coordinates, we are in the Euclidean time, and now if we see that there's a periodicity there, this periodicity we can interpret as the inverse of that temperature. So we can look at it in terms of how it actually manifests in calculations. So the trace that we evaluate here in field theory, we identify that with the path integral. We evaluated that via path integral. So a path integral has a real-time evolution, an evolution of the type e to the power minus I h t, and that corresponds to a path integral on a Lorentzian geometry. So an imaginary time evolution by analogy, which is e to the power minus dh, should correspond to a path integral on a Euclidean geometry. So the trace is evaluated. So this trace in Euclidean geometry is now evaluated for this imaginary time beta. And this trace, the fact that we are putting a trace here tells us that we have the same boundary conditions at each end. So effectively what we have is that we have a cylinder in imaginary time. We have a periodic, we effectively have a circle or a cylinder in imaginary time with the circumference of beta. So basically, yeah. So basically, this is it. So any observable that we calculate from this path integral now will automatically be periodic in beta. So was your doubt clarified, Jyotirmoy? I think this was what you were asking.
No. I was asking that the periodicity in the tau coordinate that comes from the smoothness of the geometry of the black hole, right, near the horizon. And
I think the smoothness of the geometry fixes what that period will be near the horizon. So that I'll fix via the smoothness of the geometry.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah. So as Jyotirmoy said, to move on to the next step, we have to look at a Euclidean black hole. So a Euclidean black hole, as you can see, is just we remove this sign by taking an iota inside, and this is the geometry of a Euclidean black hole. So a Euclidean black hole in this Euclidean time, and now we know that the Euclidean time via the argument here, we know that that if there is a temperature if there is a temperature there, then the Euclidean time will have a periodicity. So say the periodicity is beta. Now, in this Euclidean geometry, the radial coordinate is always restricted to r greater than rs. So r minus rs is like the like the polar coordinate. So the point here is that this transformation we had shown before also, where we go near the black hole horizon and then we expand it in terms of x naught e and xi. So so r equal to rs here is the horizon, and Euclidean black holes do not have interiors; it ends there. Now, to avoid the conical singularity at r equal to rs, so to have smoothness here, we are forced to get a value of beta, which is beta is equal to 4 pi rs. So yeah, this is a somewhat straightforward calculation, and it's easy to show that that since we have this transformation here, and we know that this is a trigonometric function, theta has to have a 2 pi periodicity. Theta has to have a 2 pi periodicity. The time te, which is the same as the x naught e, and which is the rs times the x naught e here. So if that has to have a basically 2rs times theta is equal to this te, and te has a beta periodicity. Theta has a 2 pi periodicity. So if you equate these, you end up with the fact that beta equal to 4 pi rs, which avoids the conical singularity at the horizon, which makes it smooth. So the beta is now the circumference of this time circle, far away from the horizon, which is fixed to 4 pi rs. However, close to the horizon, in this region, this is not the periodicity, and the periodicity is then fixed by the Einstein equation. Now, now we go on to the path integral itself, the path integral that we evaluate in the Euclidean geometry. So the path integral approximately takes this following form when we consider semi-classical gravity, where this e to the power minus I classical is the gravity contribution, and the z quantum is the contribution of quantum fields. From this partition function, we can now calculate entropy via the usual prescription, and this eventually after doing this calculation, one ends up with the Bekenstein-Hawking formula. So initially the area formula for the entropy. So initially we had written that area formula by analogy with thermodynamics and by identification of what the temperature is. but there is a way to derive it, and this is how that derivation is done. So yeah. So with that derivation aside, that we now have a solid basis for the entropy that we are talking about and the temperature of that black hole. We now go over to talk about Hawking radiation itself. So Hawking radiation is
So, I mean, I mean, for evaluating the partition function, don't you regulate it? I mean, if you just evaluate the classical action, do you get a finite quantity?
no, I mean there are divergences which are regulated by adding terms to the
Yeah, so there is
action.
a complicated procedure, right? I mean, to
Yes,
do
yes,
this.
it's an extremely complicated procedure. So that's why I have not even touched upon that.
Okay.
So, yeah, yeah. So yes. So now we move on to talking about what an evaporating black hole is and what it looks like and what happens there. So yeah. So on the evaporating black hole, Hawking radiation kind of carries away the energy from the black hole and carries it away to the infinity or to whatever the boundary is. So it reduces the mass of the black hole and eventually the black hole evaporates away. This is what the lifetime of the black hole, I mean, process is, the entire process is. So as an estimate, the Hawking temperature of if a Hawking temperature of a black hole is 10 to the minus 7 Kelvin, its lifetime is around 10 to the power minus 9 years. So it's pretty huge. How this calculation is, this calculation can again be heuristically done in a pretty straightforward way because the mass, the area, the temperature, everything can be written in terms of the Schwarzschild radius. Basically, since the mass is the energy of the black hole, we can write we can write Stefan Boltzmann law kind of a thing, where the loss of energy is proportional to the fourth power of the temperature, and then we'll get a differential equation which we can solve, and which would give us an approximate idea of its lifetime. But yeah, that's another calculation for another time. So the Hawking process, I'll just qualitatively describe the Hawking process. So let's begin with a black hole. So we have the horizon of the black hole, we have the singularity of the black hole, and outside we have some empty space. Now, since the space is empty outside the black hole, which means it is quote unquote empty, so it is filled by a quantum vacuum. Now, fluctuations in the quantum vacuum can happen by taking energy from the black hole, which spontaneously give rise to the two particle-antiparticle pairs, which again usually recombine after a short interval and then give back the vacuum. However, if the pair is produced very close to the horizon, one of the particles may cross into the horizon. Recall that the particle near the horizon does not see anything unusual. For that particle, it's a flat Minkowski space. So that particle might move past this invisible horizon line, but once it's past this horizon line, it cannot come out. So that is the consequence of this geometry, that nothing can come out of this horizon. So this way, this pair that is here, this pair cannot recombine at all. Therefore, the green particle here is fated to fall inside the singularity, and the orange particle just shoots out towards infinity or until it encounters something. So, so these two particles, which originally emerged from the quantum vacuum, which is the pure state, are now entangled. So if they had recombined, they would have given back the pure state, but now they are mixed states and they are entangled, and so they are going away separately, and they're not going to mix. So this is the qualitatively the process of Hawking radiation. So what effect does this process have on the black hole's evolution? So basically, the point is that once the stellar collapse has happened, this is the exterior of the black hole. The exterior is stationary, but the interior of the black hole is still collapsing. We have this collapsed star here. It is still collapsing inside. So the angular dimensions are reducing to 0, and the event horizon is somewhere here. So after some time, we start observing Hawking radiation. That there are some modes here, some Hawking modes there, some Hawking modes here. They are entangled, and these modes are carrying away the energy of this black hole. So this black hole is shrinking now. The collapsed star, this is the collapsed star here, and it's shrinking now. As it keeps on shrinking, eventually it shrinks on to a negligible size. The horizon itself, the event horizon itself shrinks on to a negligible size, and finally it pinches off, and all we are left with is a smooth spacetime containing this radiation, but the black hole is gone. So this is how the black hole lifetime goes on. In terms of the Penrose diagram, they can be represented in the following manner, where these ABCD are the represent these states here. ABCD. These are constant time slices, and these green lines. And these are the Hawking radiation quanta that are there inside, and these are paired with each other. And the interior particles are fated to fall into the horizon, and the exterior particles go out towards the fusion null infinity. So the point now here is that since we have to talk about information of the black hole, we have to find a way to treat it as a quantum system. Only then can we talk about the information that's there in the black hole. So to do that, we see that the black hole has a large number of degrees of freedom. I mean, it looks like the black hole has a large number of degrees of freedom, which obey the ordinary laws of physics, because we see we are observing thermodynamics of black hole, which are not quantum effects. So this led people to propose on how to deal with black holes as quantum system. People went on to propose what came to be known as the central dogma. So basically what the central dogma says is that, as observed from the outside, the black hole can be regarded as a quantum system with degrees of freedom of the order of area by 4 GN, h cross I factor 1. And this quantum system then evolves unitarily under time evolution. Diagrammatically, it's a bit easier to understand. Say we have this shaded region is the black hole, and we place a small cutoff outside it, at some cutoff outside it, and everything inside to an observer with respect to an observer outside, everything inside can be treated as some quantum system of this many degrees of freedom. So we can replace it by this quantum system and observe the same effects outside. So this is a proposal. So yeah. So this statement needs some clarification. So it's a statement about black holes from the outside. So it doesn't say anything about that's actually inside. When we talk about the degrees of freedom, we are not identifying the different types of degrees of freedom. We are not identifying between bosons and fermions and these kind of things. It's everything together we are saying that it's of this order. It's of this order. So these degrees of freedom are not a consequence of the gravity description. So this is what makes this a proposal. So kind of a unitary evolution implies, because we are saying that it evolves unitarily, it implies that there is a Hamiltonian that generates time evolution. Now this Hamiltonian again is not, we cannot get it from the gravity description. Now the gravity does have a Hamiltonian constraint which does dictate time evolution for classical physics, but it's a property of the entire space-time, and not just of a small or this small cutoff region that we have defined. So we don't know what's the the condition there. So this Hamiltonian is not manifest in the gravity description. And like we have said, the black hole evolves unitarily. We could just talk about the black hole if the cutoff we have placed, if this cutoff we have placed is some sort of a reflective screen. That way, everything that's inside always stays inside. It doesn't leak out or nothing comes inside and so on and so forth. But if it were the other way around, that this is just an imaginary cutoff, and the modes that are here do interact with the modes that are outside, then we cannot talk about that evolution just here would be unitary. We have to talk about the full evolution. So the full evolution that we are talking about is the quantum system of the black hole coupled with those degrees of freedom outside. So that entire thing evolves unitarily. So the full coupled evolution, it should be unitary. So this is what the dogma claims. So in this context, like the essential protocol here is to observe the effects of this quantum system by an observer that's outside this system and compare it to what we would observe for the gravity effect. So how is this black hole in this description then different from that of a hot black body? It really is not, because the hot black body can also be described by a finite number of degrees of freedom. So, however, of course, the interior of the black hole, we cannot map the complete interior of the black hole, but we can do that for a classical black body. Now, the central dogma itself is a statement about quantum information, and it's not a derivative of gravity. Now the central dogma has some points are there which are counterintuitive, in the sense that semi-classical gravity does not tell us about, semi-classical gravity does not tell us about what's inside the black hole. We cannot probe what's inside the black hole. Yet the dogma asks us to treat it as a quantum system. So there is, treat the information there as a quantum system. So so gravity does not quite support that. So this dogma has to stand these tests. So with that, the rest of the talk would be just things that support the statement, because gravity itself does not. There are many evidences that support the central dogma.
So let me just make one comment. So I think so you said that the hot coal or the general system, which is thermal, is essentially similar to black hole, but there is one huge difference, and that difference is that when a black hole is radiating, when a piece of coal is radiating, you know that the microstructure from which the radiation is coming is, every individual state is different. But for a black hole, the horizon is always very smooth. So there is no, the state that you get after the radiation is emitted is indistinguishable from, or at least for various classical questions, it is semi-classical questions, it is indistinguishable from what was before. And that's the big reason why information paradox exists. So, and that's like if you could trace the origin of the radiation, if you really could keep track of the radiation and the microstructure of the coal you could keep track of it, then the coal's there's no information paradox for coal. But for black hole, the problem is the horizon is always smooth, and yet you keep getting this thermal radiation. So that's one difference. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So from the central dogma, there are many evidences. There are evidences from string theory, from ADS-CFT, from matrix models, and yeah, so there are many evidences for that support the central dogma. So now that we have spoken a lot about entropy, we need to look a bit into detail as to how entropy is calculated. How do we define entropy? How do we calculate entropy? So we're going to talk about two notions of entropy. The first notion that we are going to talk about is the von Neumann entropy. So the von Neumann entropy is calculated in this fashion. Say we have a quantum system, we have a density matrix rho that describes the system. Then you can calculate the von Neumann entropy via this formula as a trace of rho times log rho. And this term is invariant under a unitary transformation via the properties of the trace. If rho is a pure state, the von Neumann entropy turns out to be 0. So it indicates a complete knowledge of that quantum system. So so this von Neumann entropy will come in handy. We'll use it extensively in our calculations. So the next notion of entropy that we use is the coarse-grained entropy. Simply speaking, coarse-grained entropy is the standard classical the standard classical thermodynamic entropy we evaluate for standards for other classical systems is a coarse-grained entropy. How do you evaluate a coarse-grained entropy? Is that we are not in this we are not trying to look at every microstate. We are not trying to look at every degrees of freedom. We just look at some simple coarse-grained variables. Like in ordinary thermodynamics, we look at volume, temperature, energy, pressure, etc. So these are simple coarse-grained variables. So then we proceed to calculate the coarse-grained entropy by the following procedure. We consider all possible density matrices in the system. I mean, the subsets of the full density matrix, which gives the same result as our system of the density matrix rho for the variables that we have chosen. Basically, the expectation value of the variable is defined in this manner normally. The trace of the density matrix times the variable. So So we look for all such rho tildes such that this expression is satisfied, where rho is the full density matrix of the entire system. So once we have found all of these rho tildes, we calculate the von Neumann entropy for each of them, and then we look for that rho tilde which gives the maximum value of the von Neumann entropy. So let that rho tilde be rho naught, and then the coarse-grained entropy of the variable ai is said to be the von Neumann entropy of this density matrix rho naught. Now, so this is what the coarse grain entropy is. So, like I said, an example of the coarse grain entropy is the ordinary one that we use in thermodynamics.
Budait,
Yeah.
what do you mean by all possible density matrix? I mean, can they be all related through unitary transformation? I mean, can you choose that?
No, like for example, if you're choosing some subset of that space, some subset of that unitary matrices.
Suppose I choose rho tilde to be U inverse rho U.
No,
Is
that won't
allowed?
work because
because
this
that
is
is
invariant under this transformation.
yeah. But
they can't
then
be related.
how do you define the rho tilde, and that I didn't get?
The rho tilde is, as far as I know, the rho tilde is seen as the since I mean the rho defines the full system. The rho tilde can be taken as a subset of this, which gives the same expectation value of that variable, whichever variable you are measuring.
Okay.
So it just kind of it takes into account all the relevant degrees of freedom for that which come into play, not all of them. So yeah. So as it turns out, the coarse grain entropy obeys the second law of thermodynamics. That is, the coarse grain entropy tends to increase under unitary time evolution. So this definition needs a little bit of unpacking. So the black hole entropy, which we know that it increases when the black hole first forms and its horizon goes from 0 to larger area. So this increases, the Bekenstein-Hawking entropy increases. So this can only be the thermodynamic entropy, because if it were this von Neumann entropy, it would remain a constant. But since it increases, the Bekenstein-Hawking entropy can only be this coarse grain entropy of the black hole. Now the fine-grained entropy cannot be bigger than the coarse grain entropy, because we are choosing the maximum of rho tilde, and rho tilde equal to rho is also one of these choices. So at best, when we are calculating the coarse grain entropy, it can at best be equal to the von Neumann entropy, or otherwise greater than. So it's just a consequence of the definition of these two entropies. Now, say we have a system which we can break into two parts, A and B. Then the Hilbert space of the system we can also break into two parts, H across HB. And in the usual manner, we can define the von Neumann entropy for the part A by tracing over the part B. So, I mean, the density matrix, basically, the density matrix of part A can be calculated by tracing over part B. And then we can calculate the entropy and coarse grain entropy and whatever we want there. However, if you originally started in the pure state, if this entire thing was a pure state, then the von Neumann entropy should have been 0. So, if you break it into two parts and there is some mixing and they're not individually 0, then both of them have to be equal because their total is 0. So, so this is the statement here. So, right now, it's for the rest of the calculation, it's helpful to, if we just define the fine grain entropy of the quantum fields in a region of space-time, just by that space-time. I mean, this is just a notational convenience. So the von Neumann entropy of, say, a spatial slice sigma can be defined as a von Neumann is actually the von Neumann entropy of the density matrix of quantum fields on sigma. So now sigma is as a spatial slice has an associated causal diamond. So now if there is another sigma prime which has the same causal diamond, then the von Neumann entropies are equal. This is because a usual time evolution can take sigma to sigma prime, and a time evolution would mean a unitary transformation for rho for the density matrix. So, and we have seen that the von Neumann entropy remains unchanged under this unitary transformation. And finally, we'll define a term that we'll use heavily. So we consider a gravity theory in the semi-classical limit. So, so this is what we'll do. We'll consider a gravity theory in the semi-classical limit. That is, we'll consider classical gravity and quantum fields that live in this space-time. Then, for a spatial slice, we can define the semi-classical entropy, quote unquote, as the von of this spatial slice sigma, as the von Neumann entropy of all the quantum fields and gravitons which are living on this surface. So with these notations in place, we will now move on to the Hawking information paradox. So the information paradox can be seen as an argument against the central dogma. So the point rests with understanding the Hawking radiation or the origin of it. If the central dogma were false, then the information paradox, I mean, this aspect that I'll talk about, this aspect of the information paradox that I'll talk about is not really a paradox, it would be a feature. So, I mean, of course, there are other aspects of it in other ways that it manifests. This is one of the ways that I'm talking about. So, we start by imagining a scenario. Imagine we start with a black hole which formed from a pure state. Now, this black hole starts emitting thermal radiation. We ask ourselves how something formed from a pure state emits thermal radiation. Well, because if it formed from a pure state, if it had mixed states, if the pure state was formed, if it divided into two parts, and each part has mixed states, and they together form a pure state. So now the black hole has this part of spacetime has been cut off from the rest of spacetime. Now that is a mixed state, and we know that the vacuum in QFT is entangled. So we get a mixed state inside the black hole, and that emits radiation, that is thermal. And consequence of this is the fact that if we consider just a half of the flat space in quantum vacuum, we'll get a mixed state on each half. So it was shown here in this paper that I mentioned by Wickman and company. Qualitatively speaking, the vacuum contains pairs of particles which are regularly created and annihilated. Basically, the process that I described a few slides back. So the particles that have moved outwards are now entangled with the particles that have moved inwards. So if you consider both of them together, then they are forming a pure state, and then there's zero entropy and stuff. But if you consider only one of them, say the one that is going outside, say the one that we are observing, then we end up with a thermal state, which is at some Hawking temperature, if the entanglement is sufficiently strong enough. So the Hawking radiation itself does not violate the central dogma. In fact, we kind of expect the thermal radiation as a consequence of central dogma, because we are saying that the black hole can be treated as a quantum system with certain degrees of freedom. So if the quantum system is a very complex quantum system with mixed states, weirdly entangled, then to an outside observer it will look like it is thermalized, and it will emit radiation which an outside observer will read as very close to thermal. So in the early stages, for example, if we compute the von Neumann entropy, then it would be almost thermal, because it is heavily entangled with the quantum system that's outside. So we can kind of expect that during the initial stages of the evaporation, at least, the entropy of the radiation rises. But as the black hole radiates more and more, the entropy of the radiation that is there outside, it will increase. This is what Hawking calculated. But as the black hole evaporates more and more and more, the area of the black hole will shrink. And we run into trouble when the entropy of the radiation that's outside becomes bigger than the thermodynamic or coarse-grained entropy of the black hole. The reason, the conceptual reason behind it is that the trouble arises is because now there are not enough degrees of freedom inside the black hole to be entangled with the huge ocean of degrees of freedom that we have outside the black hole. So since the number is approximately given by the thermodynamic entropy, is of the order of the thermodynamic entropy. So as the area shrinks and the thermodynamic entropy of the black hole decreases and that of the radiation increases, we run into a problem. Now we have also said that we started with a pure state. Because we started with a pure state, the total von Neumann entropy at least has to stay a constant. It has to stay the same. It has to stay zero. The total von Neumann entropy has to stay zero. So now if the von Neumann, so that means that the von Neumann entropy of the radiation that is outside the black hole and the von Neumann entropy of the black hole itself, both of them have to stay the same. But we know that this von Neumann or fine-grained entropy of the black hole cannot be more than its coarse-grained entropy, which is via there's a definition of these things. So the coarse-grained entropy is, as we know, has fallen below the von Neumann entropy because the area has shrunk, and the von Neumann entropy itself, it has to be equal to this radiation, the von Neumann entropy of radiation, that of the black hole, but this is smaller, so we run into a contradiction. So we ran into a contradiction because we treated it as a quantum system. We treated the black hole as a quantum system with some fixed number of degrees of freedom. If we had not done that, then we would not have run into this problem. So this is the paradox. As you can see, if the central dogma is true, then we expect that the entropy of the radiation would need to start decreasing at some point. There would come a point when it would need to start decreasing, and it can, specifically speaking, it can never be bigger than the Hawking entropy of the old black hole that we started with. So we expect that the entropy of the radiation should follow what is known as the Page curve. That is, the entropy of the black hole will always decrease, obviously, because the area decreases, and the entropy of the radiation increases because we are pumping more and more radiation into the into the region outside the black hole. So we expect that the black hole should follow a curve which is like the like this solid line here, which goes up and then it comes down, and it should turn around at this point, at this time, which we call the T page, which is basically the time when the Bekenstein-Hawking entropy, that the area entropy of the black hole, equals the von Neumann entropy of the radiation that has gone outside. So this was given by here, but it was given here. So yeah. So should I stop here, because I think we are running out of time now?
No, maybe you can just go ahead if you want to finish.
Okay then. Your funeral. So yeah. So so now there are some arguments that arise here to this paradox. We can protest this paradox in few ways. So there are ways which say that we can talk about the back reaction, the fact that the black hole is losing energy, its mass is decreasing, or we can say that the black hole is shrinking. So at some point semi-classical description is not going to work because it's going to be too small. So yeah, all of that is true, but they are not enough to circumvent this paradox. First of all, this T page is actually at a time, turns out to be at a time when the black hole is completely semi-classical. So the space-time is semi-classical. So all of that is there. Another argument that comes up is that, see, we are calculating the von Neumann entropy, and the von Neumann entropy is something that requires a knowledge of the quantum system. Now, this is a semi-classical gravitational system, and we cannot really claim to have a full knowledge of the quantum system that we're talking about here. So how sensible is it to compare von Neumann entropy to the coarse-grained entropy and so on? Well, to circumvent this this argument, we have Ryu Takanagi and others came up with a way to calculate the von Neumann entropy, the finite entropy, in a gravitational system. So this formula, the Hawking formula, can be seen as a coarse-grained entropy for a black hole, since it increases under time evolution. And it is clear that when the black hole is, this is especially clear when the black hole is just formed, its size increases from 0 to 4 pi rs square, and it has not emitted Hawking radiation. But there is a prescription to do a gravitational calculation for the von Neumann entropy also. So this prescription is in spirit similar to that of the Hawking calculation. So basically the point is that there we calculate a generalized entropy where we have the entropy of the fields outside some region and then the area of that region by 4gn and so on. The difference from Hawking-Bekenstein formula is that this region, this surface whose area we are calculating is not the horizon of the black hole. It can be any surface inside or a little bit outside the black hole or so on and so forth. So this choice of this dividing surface is what is new in this formula. So roughly speaking, we are going to choose a surface that generalize in which that this generalized entropy, area by 4gn plus s outside, that is minimum. So yeah, so this precise formula is the way this precise formula is applied is much more complex. So the point is that the surface we are talking about here is a codimension 2 surface. It's fixed in some coordinate direction and it is fixed in time. So we move it around in space and time and we find where the extremal surface is. To detect it, there is a prescription called the Maximin prescription, which basically asks us to choose a Cauchy slice, any Cauchy slice at some time, at the fixed time, and then find the minimal surface on it. Basically find the x which gives the minimum of this. And then we go through all the Cauchy slices that we have, that the option of all the Cauchy slices that we have, and then we find the maximum of this s on that Cauchy slice. I mean that Cauchy slice which gives the maximum value of this S. So this prescription in written in formulaic language turns out to be this, where I will just unpack this. So the X is the codimension 2 surface that we have. Sigma X here is the region that is bounded by this surface X and the cutoff surface that we're placing outside the black hole. And the semi-classical sigma X is the von Neumann entropy of the quantum fields living on this surface. Its diagrammatic representation will be helpful. So this is again the familiar Penrose diagram that we've seen. So yeah, this is the cutoff surface. At some time, there's some time here, and the time is measured along the surface. So see, X here is this codimension 2 surface that we're talking about. It's somewhere inside the black hole, and this is the region sigma X from X to the cutoff surface. So we basically minimize this, minimize this X the generalized entropy by moving this X inward, outward, and so forth. So the evaluation is basically like we start from a surface outside the black hole, then we move it inside until we find such an X where we start from this X outside and we keep moving it inside until we find such an X that minimizes this generalized entropy, and that is the prescription that is used. So of course it does depend on the geometry of the interior here. Black holes with different exterior geometry can have, same exterior geometry can have different interior geometry and can have in principle different X. So it can happen that this surface can be shrunk completely to zero. That this is indeed the minimum contribution, which gives the minimum entropy. So minimum generalized entropy. So in that case, the entropy is just the semi-classical entropy on this orange slice. So yeah. So this surface X has a special name. It's called a quantum extremal surface. It's a classical object, but it's still called a quantum extremal surface because we evaluate semi-classical entropy for quantum fields on this surface. So using this formula, we can now look at the entropy of a evaporating black hole, and this is a completely qualitative. The calculation there is the argument that I'm going to give completely qualitative argument. So we can look at the entropy of the evaporating black hole via this. So first we can look at the black hole right after it has formed. So right after the black hole is formed, it doesn't yet have Hawking radiation coming out of it immediately. So in this case, we don't see any extremal surface by deforming X inwards, assuming that it's formed from a pure state and and the geometry is smooth. So there is no extremal surface that is encountered while we move X inwards. So this quantum extremal surface shrinks to zero, and there is no area contribution to the entropy at all. So it's just the entropy of the matter enclosed by the cutoff surface, just the entropy of the matter here. So of course, this entropy, like I said, does depend on whether the black hole was formed from a pure state or the internal geometry of the black hole. So assuming that it's smooth and it's formed from a pure state, then the entropy S would just be the entropy of this region here, of the quantum fields in this region. Now, if Hawking radiation did not happen, if we ignored Hawking radiation, this S would remain fixed in time because nothing is changing. Unlike the area of the black hole, because the area of the black hole which has started at zero would now increase to the 4 pi rs square. So this is kind of in contradiction to the coarse-grained entropy of the black hole, which increases with the area. But once the black hole starts evaporating and outgoing Hawking quanta escape the black hole region, Hawking quanta come here, and there are entangled particles here. I think there's a diagram below also. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So once the black hole starts to evaporate and the outgoing Hawking quanta start to escape the black hole region, the von Neumann entropy of that region will no longer be zero because now there are particles there. Because there will be now entanglement between interior Hawking quanta and those that have escaped. So now the entropy of the quanta that we are measuring on that sigma X slice these are mixed states. So the entropy is no longer zero. So this entropy continues to grow as more and more quanta start to escape outside the black hole and even outside this cutoff region, and we end up with mixed states on the sigma X slice. So the black hole, the black hole, so this entropy that we're evaluating, this Sgen, it increases monotonically, or the Sgen of the vanishing surface. But this again would lead us to back to the same paradox, because then it would eventually fall less than the thermodynamic. It would eventually become greater than the thermodynamic entropy of the black hole, and which would again be inconsistent with the central dogma. But we have, this is what it looks like diagrammatically. That we keep pushing this surface inside, and this is the sigma x. So there will be Hawking quanta that are outside in this region, and then there will be their counterparts here, which will form a mixed state, and then thus the entropy will keep on increasing. But there is one thing that we have missed, is that there is also a non-vanishing surface contribution that ends up appearing a little bit shortly after the Hawking radiation starts. The location of this surface actually depends on how much of the Hawking radiation has escaped and where we are in time and so on and so forth. But in general, it lies very close to the horizon. Its location is obtained via this prescription. So along the cutoff surface, from at the time where we are trying to obtain the extremal surface, we move back by a time of the order of RS log SPH. This is called a scrambling time. And once we move back by this time, we shoot an ingoing light ray inside, and wherever that light ray intersects on the horizon, the extremal surface X is claimed to be close to this region. So these time intervals are very less than the lifetime, so we don't run into any problems here. Now the generalized Hawking entropy now has an area term as well, because we have a non-vanishing area that has appeared. So this is no longer the entropy of if we had extended this entire slice inside, that entropy would be greater than the entropy if we had this area. So we now have an area term. So after a good enough amount of time, so the quantum field's entropy is relatively low, because it has not captured a whole lot of Hawking states, because this is very close to the horizon here, and thus the entropy at this stage is being dominated by the horizon area. So we can approximate it to the horizon area times by 4gn. So this generalized entropy, since the horizon area is decreasing, because the black hole has formed, it's the full horizon, and the horizon area started decreasing. So this follows the thermodynamic entropy of the black hole. So this is Sgen of the non-vanishing surface. This is the dominant term, and the dominant term goes decreasing, and this is so on and so forth. So yeah. So the fact that this is indeed a minimum, that this is indeed a minimum of the entropy, has to be shown by modulating, by wiggling around X a little bit and seeing that it balances that S semi-classical balances the change in entropy. Like usually we try for an extrema, that it wiggles around a little bit, but it bounces back to the same point. So we can look at this intuitively for a minima. So this process can be looked at intuitively a little bit. So we can deform the X along the null direction a little bit, take it a little bit inside. Now this area of X has decreased. Now since the area of X has decreased, the entropy will decrease a little bit, and S semi-classical does not immediately increase. So it say, for example, we are does not immediately increase, or say it also does not decrease. The point is that as the surface moves inside, it starts to decrease initially a little bit as we start including Hawking modes whose counterparts are still within the cutoff. So they neutralize each other and the S semi-classical falls. But as we go a little bit further, a little bit inward, we end up encountering Hawking modes whose counterparts have already escaped outside the cutoff surface. And because that has happened, they will contribute to the entropy and they will increase their entropy. They'll provide a positive contribution. So the decrease in the area is after a short interval, after a short time, balanced by the S semi-classical. So this kind of proves that that the x, if we choose the appropriate extremal surface, we have a minima there. So yeah, so so we have two such contributions. We have a growing contribution from the vanishing surface at certain times, and then we have a decreasing contribution from the non-vanishing surface. Now we are asked to take the minimum of those as because that is what how we define the entropy. So initially, right after we start, only the vanishing surface exists, because inside it's still a pure state, and we can still take the x inside and get the minima. And so the vanishing surface, only the vanishing surface exists. So it gives the contributions. The area contribution starts at 0 and grows monotonically until the black hole evaporates. Now, a short time after the black hole forms, the non-vanishing surface is created, and it starts at a large value, because as we have seen, the surface is very close to the black hole horizon. So it starts at more or less this 4 pi rs square contribution, but it decreases slowly. So the vanishing surface so once the vanishing surface contribution captures the vanishing surface contribution, since it's low initially, it captures the entropy in the initial stage, and then later when it becomes much larger, but the area entropy of x, when that becomes smaller, so now that entropy represents the that area entropy represents the true entropy of that black hole. So the true entropy of that black hole follows this red curve here. This is the SGen of the non-vanishing surface, which, as we have seen, decreases because the area decreases. And this is the SGen of the vanishing surface, which is basically just the the S semi-classical sigma L, because as more and more quanta start pumping out, it starts to get more and more entangled, and so on and so forth. So basically, initially when we had started, so we could have taken it inside, right inside, and there was no area contribution. But as we proceed forward, we end up with the surfaces x, and their contribution becomes lower than the contribution from these surfaces sigma x, and they start to describe the true entropy. So with that, with this description of the entropy applied to an evaporating black hole, we do see that the evaporating black hole does take this shape, take the page curve shape. So yeah, that also still does not solve the paradox, because the paradox was about radiation, not about the black hole. This is the black hole's entropy. So as the last section, which I hope I'll finish in the next 10 minutes, we will. Is somebody saying something?
Yeah, Budayat, you have like 5 minutes or so.
Okay. Yeah. So okay, fine. Yeah, fine. I'll be very, very, very brief here. So the point here is calculating the this prescription is that the point here, I'll just show it via the diagrams. The point here is when we are calculating the entropy of the black hole, a region connecting this x and this cutoff surface, and we are calculating the semi-classical entropy there, the x here. Here, while calculating the entropy of the radiation, it changes a little bit, because we are calculating the entropy of the radiation that is outside the cutoff, that is seen by our observers outside, and it includes the entire region from the cutoff to infinity. So we are calculating the radiation here. However, we also include a term here. We are also instructed to include a term here by the gravitational path integral itself, and that is a complicated calculation, and that is something that I don't know about. But the point here is that we include this region inside the black hole, which we call an island, and it ends at this extremal surface x. So the radiation of the the entropy of the radiation is now defined via this max-min procedure on this generalized entropy, which is the area x pi 4 gn plus the semi-classical entropy of this region, this sigma rad, plus this region. So yeah, so this is the full entropy of the radiation, because the radiation here does experience some gravitational effects. which we don't know about, because gravity cannot be treated as purely classical inside the black hole. We don't know what goes on with the quantum particles inside the black hole. So this expression is a is a bit of an leap towards that. In the fact that we treat the quanta that are present on this surface as ordinary semi-classical quanta, even though we don't know what is actually going on here, and the extra effects of whatever is happening, the gravitational effects, are condensed into this area term. So this is a semi-classical entropy of radiation, and this thing we conclude is this thing we calculate is the total entropy of the radiation, including the gravitational effects that we are encountering. So with this in place, so as it turns out, initially we don't find any initially in the initial case we don't find any islands. We just start with this sigma rad, and as it goes on, as we progress in time, more and more Hawking quanta start coming outside the black hole, and they are all mixed states because their counterparts are inside. So this so the S-gen that is without any islands, it also keeps on monotonically increasing. And as we know that the thermodynamic entropy of the black hole keeps on falling because the area keeps on decreasing. But after a sufficient enough time of the order of this scrambling time, we encounter an island. We are asked to imprint an island here. So the point here is that as we imprint islands, we include these regions also. Now these regions contain Hawking modes which are coupled to these. So what this causes is that they nullify the modes here, and the entropy falls. Now because the entropy falls, we have seen that the S-gen with the islands has a decreasing nature because the main contribution comes from the area, and the area decreases, similar to what we have seen for a black hole. So again, we take the minimum of these two, and we end up with this case here, where the S-gen without the island is monotonically decreasing, and the S-gen without, and the with the island is decreasing, without the island is increasing, and the contribution, we take the minimum of those two things, and then we end up as in this dark red line, which is indeed the page curve. Diagrammatically, you can represent it here, like initially at the earliest times there is no island, and then we move forward again, we don't see any island, and then eventually an island appears. This is when this happens, and eventually the contribution from the island becomes, as the black hole shrinks, it becomes lesser than that of the contribution from this region, from without the island, and so and so we get this page curve. So I'll just conclude with one last point. Last point is that, say we had started with a pure state, we kind of expect that the entropy of the black hole and the entropy of that radiation have to be, they have to be the same. So as it turns out, if one looks at the previous case of the black hole, we had this X here where I'm pointing, and there was a surface connecting these 2 points. So basically, the entropy of this entire thing is since we started with a pure state, the entropy on this surface is same as the entropy on this plus this. And if this was the extremal surface and the island, so the area would be the same. So intuitively, we can see that the expressions actually give the same result. So basically, the semi-classical on sigma x, which was defined connecting these 2 points, is equal to the semi-classical on this and this, because we started with the pure state. So the addition of islands here is not an arbitrary thing. There actually is a mathematical basis for including it. But yeah. So I guess that's all. That's all I'm going to talk about. Okay.
Okay. Let us thank Udaditya for his wonderful talk. And so I can stop recording, and if anybody has any question,